Zander,
Hello.
the transition issue is very complex, and you have a certain position in it generationally and professionally.
Mm.
And I guess ideologically, everybody's kind of got like a different frame of mind in considering what transition is and what being trans is. And so I'm really grateful to be able to get your insight and add it to my understanding of the entire issue, which is complex and fraught.
It is. So I'm 55. I'll be 56 very soon. So there's the generational piece.
Are you a Cancer?
And I am. I'm a double Cancer, actually.
What does that mean?
Let's see if I remember correctly. My mom was all into this stuff. So my birth sign is Cancer. My my
Your
moon is in
is in
Cancer.
Okay, yeah. Something like
Yeah,
that.
and then my sun is in Sagittarius,
Okay.
which I think is what is the fire part, right? Because a double Cancer is sort of like I
Water,
should
water.
be, yeah, quite like a moody person who stays home and bakes a lot of bread or something. But I'm neither of those things. I do prefer to be at home than anywhere else in the world. That's for sure.
Hmm.
But
I
yeah.
hear you there.
And I also started my medical transition when I was 39 years old. So that's also a difference, right? In that
Hmm.
when we talk about like children going through a social or medical transition, like maybe teenagers actually for the medical part, and young adults. So I was 39, so it's like I lived in the world as a lesbian, or I use the term dyke for all those years. I came out as lesbian when I was 14, maybe just about 14, around 13 and a half, 14 years old, and had my first girlfriend when I was 14. So I was very much just, doing the lesbian thing. It didn't really dawn on me that there
And
was any other
that would have
option.
been in the mid 80s.
That would have been the late 70s.
Oh, okay. Which is a different era than the 90s where I was a teenager.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I was, let's see. So I was born in 1966. So
Hmm.
yeah, so that goes way back. So things were very different. And, we were just starting to back in the mid to late 70s, just starting to challenge. I shouldn't say just starting. We were continuing the challenging of gendered norms
Mm-hmm.
around what could a girl or a woman do, or somebody who was female, what could they do, how could they dress, what kind of occupations could they go into. And so I remember in school hearing a lot about, I could grow up to be anything and anyone. I could wear whatever clothes I wanted to wear, right? There was really an explosion of that. I remember going into department stores and they actually had a rack of clothes right between the boys and the girls section at J.C. Penney with these, the brand of the clothing was called Garanimals. They have them now, but they're very different. They're very boy and girl. Back then they were very androgynous, and there was little labels on them like an elephant or a giraffe or hippopotamus, and you found a top with one of those animals and the matching a bottom with the same animal. And that's right. We wore earth shoes, right? Brown shoes, bowl haircuts. I mean, like it was, there was a sort of a flattening almost of,
Mm.
there were still people who were very girlish and very boyish, but there was a whole bunch of us that were sort of like in that, I don't know, maybe you'd say androgynous kind
Mm-hmm.
of presentation. So that was definitely me.
Was there significant amount of disparagement or bullying that you had to deal with being a lesbian in the 70s and the 80s?
I dealt with bullying in grade school, not because of anything that was about gender or sexual orientation. What I mean by gender, like my gender expression, any masculinity or something like that.
Hmm.
I received a lot of bullying in grade school because I had been paralyzed as a kid. I contracted encephalitis following an MMR vaccination, where I ended up with rubella, the German measles, and I had to be put into a medically induced coma. And when they brought me out, I was paralyzed. And so I walked funny, right? Funny. And I talked funny because I was actually paralyzed straight down the left side of my body. So when I went back to school in the third grade, I missed first and second grade. I was bullied because I talked funny, I walked funny. But by the time I was in, let's see, sixth grade, I was done with the wheelchair, the crutches, and the leg braces, and I was the fastest girl runner in my primary school. So I
Oh.
was like a little Forrest Gump, running down, breaking out of the leg braces. Um, and so that but I was bullied because of that. I actually became a bully as a result. But hear me out, no daggers yet. What I mean by that is little kids, or kids who were being picked on, I should say, would come to me and say, so and so's picking on me. So I became like the bully of the bullies. I
Oh
would
yeah,
bully the bullies.
vigilante Batman style.
Oh yeah, no, I love superheroes. Yeah, somebody referred to me once as a Robin Hood bully, right?
Hmm.
That I was protecting the more vulnerable kids, the smaller kids, the kids that were kind of, chubby or whatever they were being picked on for, because I knew what that felt like. And I never wanted to do that to anybody. But I didn't have a problem with scaring the crap out of bullies
Hmm.
who ended up mostly to be cowards anyway, like,
Hmm.
which is not a surprise, right?
Hmm.
The bullying is typically just a shield, right? It's like a protection layer,
Hmm.
which I know now. So I wouldn't do that right anymore. But at the time I didn't understand. I just didn't like people picking on kids.
Yeah. And was it a shock or a surprise or uncomfortable to realize your sexual orientation was not heterosexual?
No. I ended up, I actually did like boys quite a bit when I was younger, and like sixth, seventh grade. But then I was considered a juvenile delinquent. I was doing juvenile delinquent things. And so I got sent off to a group home for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, where I was living with all girls. So there were about 42 of us living in this sort of in the countryside, living in these homes, and then all being picked up every morning and taken to our own school. And so I was sort of maturing. I was like, what, 14, 15 years old. I was maturing in this all girl environment. And somebody had told me that, there was some people had girlfriends, and I was like, oh, I wasn't taken aback by it, but I was a little surprised. And when in Rome, so I got myself a girlfriend, and it just sort of stuck. I liked the company of the girls. When I went back to high school, I sort of, I guess, had a choice in some ways. Like, well, I could stay just dating the girls, or I could date the boys, or maybe both. Right? That wasn't a bad thing even then. And so, but I didn't know what to talk to boys about or how to talk to them. And so I thought, I'm not even going to bother with it. So I just stuck with, dating or having girlfriends, and then eventually, having more adult relationships with women.
Mm-hmm.
My wife and I have been together almost 20 years now. So I've been in a long-term relationship. But as far as like bullying with around sexual orientation, gender identity, I mean, no, I didn't go to high school for the full 4 years because I was in that girls' school, right? So I wasn't in public school for very long because I was there probably maybe my sophomore year and a little bit of my junior year. And then I got kicked out of my high school, went to an alternative high school, got kicked out of that school, and then went to an adult school, adult education, and then thought that was stupid and left, and then got my GED. And so I didn't do very much of high school, but when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend. She was a cheerleader. I had a fake ID and a car. I was going up to West Hollywood. I grew up in Los Angeles, and going to a bar called Peanuts on Santa Monica Boulevard and watching all the drag shows. So I was very much embedded in all that. But if you think back to that time, well, you probably can't, but if you know what I'm talking about, probably if I mention it, like we're talking about the early 80s. And while I'm in high school, you have Boy George, right? And you've got David Bowie, and you've got Freddie Mercury, and you've got hair bands, right?
Yeah.
And so men wearing mascara and big fluffy hair and skirts and singing like, gay anthems like Erasure, and you know what I mean? It was a Duran Duran. It was a very different time. And so, we had mod and ska and rockabilly kids walking around campus. Boys with mascara on campus was not that big of a deal. And so there didn't seem to be I didn't see a lot of bullying around that. I didn't receive it. But maybe because I was in school with people who remembered me, how I used to be, right? When I was in elementary school and a little bit of middle school where I bullied the bullies. So I had a reputation maybe of the kind of person you don't want to mess with. Because I'm the same size now that I was then, but I'm more muscular now because of the testosterone. But I'm 5'9". I was 5'9" in high school. So
Okay.
yeah, and I was an athlete in high school. So
Your story is so checkered, or your past is so checkered. Like the coma, disease, and
juvenile delinquency.
Delinquency. Were you just a wild person? Did you just, the world was just boring as it is, and you just like to get into trouble?
I've never been bored. I keep myself very occupied. No, I don't want to go into details about it, but I did suffer quite a bit of what I think people would probably call religious abuse now from one of my grandparents that was one of my caretakers, a primary caretaker.
Okay.
And so that sort of, that messed me up a little bit when I was younger. I was angry, and so I was acting out. I didn't understand it at the time.
Yeah.
But she died when I was 13. And so it still took me a couple of years to sort of work my way through that. But eventually I sort of burned through that anger. But yeah, I mean, I got into some trouble.
Yeah. But
nothing I didn't do jail time, thank goodness. That's mostly because I never got caught, but I was doing things that my parents were well aware of, and they were concerned about my well-being. So. But
things chilled out. You get into your 20s?
I joined the military.
Oh, okay. What prompted that?
Well, that's another sort of story. I was in a relationship with a woman who was much older than me. And it turns out she was an alcoholic and a physically abusive person, which I didn't understand or know about. I didn't grow up around that addiction or, physical abuse in that manner. So my parents were divorced, so I never saw any sort of physical stuff between my parents. And so I didn't realize that kind of stuff happened in a relationship. I was naive, I guess, in that way. And so I was I was afraid for my life, and I wanted to get as far away as I could, as quickly as I could. And the military promised me that. Yeah. Technically, what I did is I got down a piece of paper. I sat down with a piece of paper and I wrote pro-con lists. And one was suicide. One was commit a federal crime, because I knew it'd be better to go to a federal prison than a state prison. Somehow there's more, maybe amenities. Bowling alleys, something. Yeah. And I mean, I was like, what was I? I was 20 years old when I was doing this, by the way, and joined the military. And joined the military, won out. So that, thankfully, I went into the Coast Guard and had had a good time. So.
Okay, so this is I'm just spitballing. So this is what, you're born in 69, so this is like 89 then?
86.
So I remember the Clinton era don't ask, don't tell, like it was a debate, gays in the military. What was your take or your experience?
93.
Okay, yeah.
So I was in the military prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Commonly referred to, its nickname within the community, at least within gay and lesbian communities, the witch hunt days. But the Coast Guard was Department of Transportation, not defense. Now it's Homeland Security. So it is it's an armed force, but it only comes under the Department of Defense in certain times, like certain times of war. So the Coast Guard is a domestic service. They rarely go overseas. We do go overseas, but not as often for the same kinds of things. And so under the Department of Transportation, they weren't really doing the same witch hunts as the Department of Defense branches were doing.
So in the 80s, they were targeting gays and lesbians in the military. And what were they doing? Just kicking them out, or putting them through some sort of punishment? Or
typically you'd show up at a base and you'd either be given a piece of paper or a verbal instruction of the places you're not allowed to go in town. And they would be like, the gay bars and the lesbian bars and the peep shows and the You know, the nudie bars, you know, those kinds of places that were always right near military bases. And like literally in San Diego, where I was serving, there's a gay bar across the street from one of the naval stations, which used to be, I think, the boot camp years ago. So, I mean, it's just, they put it right there. It's too tempting. And I think they call it the porthole or something like that. It's still there. But so, you know, when I got to San Diego, there was a list of places, and thankfully they provide those because then you know where to go. You know, there were 2 lesbian bars in San Diego back then. And so, you know, I knew where to go. I didn't go, but I knew where I could go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But you weren't under threat as a coastie.
I was not under
persecution.
threat as a coastie.
Okay, yeah.
No, no. Thankfully. I mean, that's not to say that there weren't coasties at the time who might have been. It depends on the command. Yeah. But I was not. I was very fortunate.
Were you politically active with regard to the gay, lesbian, etc. community in the 80s and the 90s? Was that a thing that you were interested in? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the first thing I was involved in politically, and this was before I went into the military, actually, because I went into the Coast Guard when I was 20. So between when I turned 18 and before I went into the military, shortly after I turned 20, I did have a couple of years where I was able to be active in some things, like because you have to be 18 to stand at like a table asking for people to sign petitions, things like that. Yeah. And so the first thing that I was involved in was getting people to sign petitions to incorporate West Hollywood. West Hollywood at the time in Los Angeles County was unincorporated. And so the police services and the fire services were coming from Los Angeles County, like the sheriff's office and the county fire department. And you know, we won that. So West Hollywood is its own incorporated city with its own mayor and its own, you know, police and fire services, but it wasn't back then. I was also involved in some of the youth activities. So growing up in Los Angeles, it's still there. I think, I'm not sure what part of Los Angeles it's in anymore. I think maybe it was in Long Beach, back in the time, but they had a pen pal club for gay and lesbian teenagers. And so I would write in, and then I'd be sent a name of somebody that I could write to. And so I did that a few times when I was a late teenager. And I'm trying to think of some other things. When I was in the alternative high school, so between regular high school and the adult school, I did a short stint in the alternative high school. And there were a bunch of gay and lesbian kids in that school. And so one of my good friends was also a young lesbian. And she had an older girlfriend that was like probably in her early 20s, and we were like 16 years old. So, and so I would go over to her house because she didn't even live with her parents. She lived with her girlfriend. And so I would go over there. And so through that, I was introduced to a lot of older lesbian women, you know, still young 20s, late teens. And so we were involved in different efforts, but more on the recreational side, like softball team and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah. But the politics, not so much until I got out of the Coast Guard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which would be the 90s or so?
No, I was only in for 2 years. I was medically discharged. I got injured on the job. So I was out by 88.
Were you wrestling with a whale or something? Or punching a sea lion?
That's funny. Some people are like, you tripped in the puddle. No,
you don't have to answer. I'm just trying to figure out how Coast Guards get.
Yeah. Well,
industries.
Back then, the Coast Guard was a law enforcement arm of the Department of Transportation. So one of the other nicknames of Coasties is Smokies of the Sea. We're like police on the water.
Yeah. Okay.
We're like police and firefighters on the water. So my job, I was an EMT and a firefighter and a boarding officer. So law enforcement is what I was doing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
First responder stuff. The Coast Guard does search and rescue. They do drug running.
Yeah.
So.
Was it adventurous? Was that adventurous time?
Yes.
It was 2 years. Yeah.
I mean, I was in San Diego.
San Diego.
Nice. Yeah. So
how did being a lesbian? How did it in your 30s you come across transition, and how did that make sense? Did you know? Were you introduced to it? I'm sure in Hollywood you've known transsexuals for
Yes.
a while, but you never thought about it as something that you would do?
No, because I only saw drag queens and female impersonators, right? So people who were doing like Cher and Barbara Streisand impersonations. And I knew about transsexual women and I knew about cross dressers, but it wasn't until I was probably, I'm trying to remember, it would probably have been maybe in the mid 1990s when a friend of mine in San Diego moved away to San Francisco and came back with a new name and looking and sounding very differently. And I was like, I was like, what's going on there? And somebody explained it to me, but it kind of went in one ear and out the other. It didn't really compute. And then I saw a documentary, You Don't Know Dick, which features trans men. And that was in maybe 96. And that made a little more sense. But I sort of was like, that's interesting. And then in 1997, somebody showed me a book called Body Alchemy by Lauren Cameron, a transsexual man who's a photographer, and he took a bunch of pictures of him and other trans men. And then I was like, oh, those men in that book, I remember them from that documentary. And it planted a seed, so to speak. But again, that was 1996, and I didn't start testosterone until 2005. So it obviously didn't prompt too much, but it was something in the back of my mind. And then I went to the women's bookstore when I was in college in Denver in 1997, 98. I went to a women's bookstore where Leslie Feinberg was reading from the book Stone Butch Blues. And it's somewhat autobiographical, but not entirely. And in the book, there is a story of like a very butch lesbian, right? A masculine woman who is working like as a man, was actually taking testosterone, and I think maybe was binding or had top surgery. And I remember talking to Les Feinberg at the bookstore about, all these different words that she was using. And one of them was transgender. And she explained that transgender, and again, this is in the mid 1990s, right? So the context is different than now. She explained that a person can be transgender because they transgress gender norms. Well, I mean, as a masculine woman, as a dyke, I mean, a very butch woman. So I thought. I wasn't as butch as, the butcher of the group. But the idea was, that made sense to me. And I was working in the GLBT Student Services office at my college in Denver in the 90s. And so I thought, oh, well, I guess I'm trans. And so that was around 1998, actually. Or 97, 98. And so I took on sort of a social identity as trans, but I had no intention of doing any hormones or anything like that because it didn't make any sense to me. I could be trans because trans just meant I was transgressing.
Well, what did that social identity do? How did it serve you? Like just having that label, that title, that conception of yourself in relationship to society.
It didn't change much of anything. And I didn't use it as an identity in that way. Yeah. It was just more of like what would you say? Just a piece of, right? A piece of how I was presenting. It was more like gender presentation than like who I was. But I did stop calling myself a lesbian at that point in time. My preferred term at the time, which is now considered problematic, but I still say it was tranny queer. And so, I don't use queer that much anymore, but I do call myself a tranny all the time. But again, no idea I knew about hormones. I was actually being exposed through the GLBT Student Services Office to a lot of trans people. And in Denver, Colorado, they have something called the Gender Identity Center, which has been there for a long time, a few decades. And so they even have a conference in Denver every year for the trans community. So I was going to things like that and I was being exposed to that community. I guess this community now is a trans man, but I was sort of on the periphery of it at that point, even though I was in the community.
Due to the political nature and the certain, one might say, authoritarian currents within the transgender, trans conversation, there are groups that have started up in the last few years that want to separate the gay and lesbians from and the LGB from the rest of the so-called acronym or initialism. But it's what you're describing in the 90s was that almost, I don't, this probably, I know this is not completely accurate, but the trans community was kind of within or a subset of the gay community. There was a friendly relationship. There was, they're just kind of everybody was kind of just in mixers constantly, and trans was just kind of a subset of the gay and lesbian community, or?
Not entirely, and it differed geographically, right? The smaller the community you lived in, the fewer places for coming together you had, and so that would sort of force the issue a little bit. But in Denver was a very, it's a metropolitan city, had a big gay and lesbian community and trans community. I'd say that there was some variations on that. So, for example, you could have people like me who were females, but very masculine women who were maybe trans identifying, but still within the realm of like the lesbian kind of understanding of that. And we would be in like gay and lesbian space. There were always drag queens, and sometimes, the transsexual women, but a lot of times there were separate bars that had the cross dressers. The cross dressers would go out. And like I've been to many lesbian bars over the years, and I don't recall ever seeing a cross dresser come into a lesbian bar. I'm sure it happens, but I never witnessed that. In the larger cities, there were gay bars and lesbian bars, and so when I lived in smaller locations, smaller cities, things were more I wouldn't say homogenous, but it was integrated. Yeah. We might have sort of parsed ourselves off into little cliques within the establishment, but there was some of that going on. And again, in the big cities, not so much, but there were opportunities for people to come together. But I don't know I don't recall how welcoming everybody was of all that. I know within lesbian separatist community, which is where I sort of found myself in my 30s, there wasn't a big love for the transsexual women. Right, because they weren't women. We didn't want them in our space, kind of thing. Like I never said that, but that was sort of the sentiment of the group overall.
Lesbian separatism. I've heard of it. What was it like for you? What was the reigning kind of theory behind it and reason for it?
My recollection was that the patriarchy was bad.
Yeah.
And that meant men were bad. And so a lot of women I knew, they went off to live in women's land, and they spelled women with a Y, WOMYN. Yeah. Or they would spell it like womb in, or and so it was, pretty cliche, like man haters, and it's interesting because I wasn't actually like that. Most of the negativity I had experienced in my earlier years was all from women. So my father, the men in my family were quite loving and warm, and the women were quite cold and mean. And so when I went into the lesbian community, and I think it was because my friend back in that school when we were 16, I think her girlfriend and those women, I think they were separatists. So I sort of by default, I ended up in that community, and but I never really took to it. But I didn't really realize until a little bit later that there were all these subcultures in the lesbian community. And once I realized that, I sort of branched out a little bit, but it was hard to not constantly see or run into or be involved in activities if you were part of a lesbian community that incorporated the separatists in it, because they were just part of the community.
I'm sure that it's the case that gay community and lesbian community kind of just operate differently, but there's a pattern that I've witnessed of lesbians being very politically active, or having it seems a little bit more politically active than gay community typically. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's the gist
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I would imagine, well, during the early '80s with ACT UP, with all of the issues going on
HIV.
around
Yeah.
HIV and AIDS,
Yeah.
there was a lot of attention that had to be diverted to, healthcare issues and making sure people were getting fed and their laundry was being done. And so a lot of lesbians sort of turned towards becoming caregivers for individuals on a community level. And so there was a lot of diverted attention there, but there was a lot of activities going on. And I think that ACT UP was largely men, right? Gay men and some lesbians. And then ultimately, I think it, became just, gays and lesbians and allies, of course. But, I remember hearing a lot within the lesbian community, this slogan, which is the personal is political. I believe it was Kate Millett that said that. And she was a lesbian singer-songwriter. And so that was a very popular, slogan to hear people saying or having bumper stickers about it. So I think that there really was that kind of sentiment within certain elements of lesbian community that the personal is political. And so to be politically active in the world was like something that was highly regarded.
From what I'm gathering, I don't know your entire autobiography, but from what I'm gathering, it seems like you're action-oriented rather than theory-oriented or slogan-oriented. It seems like you were involved to do things rather than to proclaim things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've studied theory. I have, degrees, but they don't stick with me very much. Like I learn them and then I take what makes sense and what I find to be applicable, and I just sort of disregard or discard the rest. So I'm much more of a doer than a thinker. Yeah. I do think about things, but I don't spend my time doing that. Yeah.
Well, I have kind of a slogan of my own about like the activist community is kind of actually divided into pot clangers and dishwashers, and there's a bunch of people that like to clang pots, but when it comes time to actually doing the work, they kind of disappear and stuff. And
yeah, if I were in that scenario, I'd be the one making sure that everybody was drinking water and knew where the bathrooms were. So sort of very hospitality oriented. Yeah. Oh, I love ushering. Oh my God. Right. So yeah, basically like orienting people. I like that kind of job of making sure like, okay, don't forget to take a rest and get your water. And here's the bathroom and, say hello to so-and-so and introducing people so that was actually more of my role. It still is in a lot of the things that I do. So I naturally fall into that. So yeah.
So you had these seeds of the idea of transgenderism and transsexualism and transition, and you're aware of them. But how did it become more and more present in your consciousness?
Let's see. So I mentioned that one friend from San Diego, right? Moved away, came back, new name, sounding, looking differently. Then I went off to college and I met, right, because I had seen the book, I had seen the film, right, You Don't Know Dick, but now I'm actually meeting people. I'm in college, mid to late 90s in Colorado, and I'm meeting a couple of trans men. That's how they talked about themselves. And I didn't care for them too much. I didn't like their attitude. I'll give you an example. I was running the Speakers Bureau through the GLBT Student Services Office, and I invited this one trans man to be on a panel with me. And so he sat next to me and put his feet up on the table in a classroom. And he started to talk about how people are more disrespectful to him now. And I kind of turned to him and I said, well, maybe if you didn't put your feet up on the table, like in a public space, like, I was just so bothered by him. So I to me, it looked like that wasn't a really good option. What happened to that person that they'd be like that? I thought it was the testosterone. That's one of the things that I got from the separatist community that sort of stayed with me, was that testosterone was poison and it made men violent. And, I read that article in Ms. Magazine. It told me that testosterone was poison. It was written by Alan Alda from MASH. And so I believed it. I believed those kinds of things. And so I was reluctant that was part of the reason I was reluctant to do a medical kind of transition, because I thought the testosterone would make me violent. And I didn't have something called like gender identity disorder. That's what it was called back then. That didn't make any sense to me. So the medical transition didn't seem like the right route for me. I was just going to stay trans, and I was going to, do it sort of my way. But then I think I was probably in my mid 30s. Yeah, right around 36 years old, 37. And I think I hit some sort of threshold where it was like a tipping point happened for me, where the accumulation of dealing with, because you had talked about like gender and sexual orientation stuff and bullying, like in the context of school and stuff, but I didn't face that. But what I did face was out in public, total strangers, right? So total strangers would confront me in the bathroom, like girls, women in the bathrooms. I almost got beat up once in a train station in Los Angeles. It was very scary.
By
a group of teenage girls.
Oh, girls. Interesting.
Yeah, when I was like 19. Oh, yeah, no, they're vicious.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, and
so
then
it's not all testosterone.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. It's fault.
But yeah, full circle there. But and just I would see looks in people's eyes, and the way I would talk about what I'm about to say in the past is I would say people were looking at me with contempt in their eyes and disgust and disdain. I reframe it now and say my interpretation of how they were looking at me was contempt, disgust, and disdain, because I understand now that I really have no idea what they were thinking or what they were feeling. It was my interpretation of their looks. However, my interpretation mattered to me. And so the effect that it was having accumulatively, right, over year after year after year, from say age 16 to 36, I had just had it. I had reached a tipping point where I was like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. But I didn't exactly know what to do, because I couldn't take testosterone because it would make me violent. And so I just started, I was looking for solutions, but I didn't know what they would be. 3 years later, when I was 39, I went and talked to a doctor. I should say I went and listened to a doctor talk in an auditorium filled with trans people, trans men, not on testosterone, wanting to know all about testosterone. And it was like a 2.5 hour long lecture on testosterone for the trans man, or FTM. That's the language we used back then, female to male transsexual. And at the end of that, I was convinced I could start testosterone, because she completely dismissed the concept of testosterone making you violent and aggressive, that it was hormone imbalance that did not. Right? Not testosterone itself. And she at that point had been working with trans patients for about 12 years. So that was 2005. And so I went home immediately and told my wife, I'm starting testosterone, which of course was a bit abrupt, considering I had mentioned that I wasn't going to do testosterone for a few years at that point. Yeah. So that was kind of it. It was like my own internalized sense. Like, this is before I became a social worker. This is before I had undergone too much kind of therapy to get me in touch with like my interpretation of how people were looking at me, my ability to reframe things. I didn't have a clear understanding of that then. And so I really did let all of those looks and the things that people said really bother me. I was in a lot of distress, but I wasn't in distress because of my gender. I was in distress because of people's response to my gender or reaction to my gender. So I remember in 2007, I wrote a blog post about saying, I don't have gender identity disorder. Society has a gender identity disorder. That's what I wrote then. So, and I stick by it. So like, so some people say to me, oh, you don't feel like you were born in the wrong body? No, never. As a kid who went through paralysis, I'm glad to have a body that's functioning. I'm glad to be alive. So no, I don't feel like I was born in the wrong body. Do I feel like from a really young age that I was supposed to be a boy. I have no idea, because with the paralysis and the encephalitis, I lost all my childhood memories. And my parents told me over the years that I never mentioned things like that. I should be a boy, or why aren't I a boy? None of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was a tomboy, very much so. But I didn't get any pushback for that. I was allowed to be a tomboy. And I know Buck Angel has talked about that. He's a friend of mine. He was allowed to be a tomboy growing up. So there's some benefit to being able to be in families where you're allowed to do that. So I never felt any sort of incongruence. I just thought my masculinity was because I was lesbian. And I didn't have any problem being a lesbian. My family was totally fine with me being a lesbian. And I'm first generation American. My family's from Mexico. Like, I'm Mexican Catholic, and there was never a problem with me being lesbian or now being trans. Never for a minute. So if anybody has a problem with it, they've never said it to me. So, which I don't, they can have any problem they want with it. That's their opinion, but yeah.
So going on testosterone and becoming a FTM, female to male transsexual, it wasn't about being a man. Like, now I need the world to see me as a man. It's just like, I'm just gonna kind of Blanchard. I know it's controversial, but he made two types of male to female transsexual, one the autogynephile and then the homosexual transsexual. The latter category, homosexual transsexual, or HSTS, is a man who's so effeminate that it makes sense for him to transition because it makes life smoother for him socially. That sounds similar to what you're.
Yeah, I've heard of Dr. Blanchard. I haven't read his books. And I've heard of autogynephilia, but yeah, so the homosexual, it makes sense in that way but initially, I'd say the first 3 years that I was on testosterone, I didn't want to be a man. I didn't have any sense of being a man, not even a trans man. I didn't call myself things like that. I started out calling myself gender queer, which isn't as popular anymore. But it was back then, gender queer, and I had been very androgynous, right, as a woman. So the idea of being, gender queer was similar. It was like the trans version of androgynous in some ways, and that's also because I was so early in testosterone that nobody was ever going to see me as a man. Right. I still looked like a dyke for about 2.5 years on testosterone. So my voice was changing. Things were starting to change, but not very quickly. And maybe that's because I was older when I was taking the testosterone. My receptors might not have been as finely tuned as somebody who's like 19. Right. And so they might not have been as sensitive. But eventually what ended up happening is, as more and more people started seeing me as a man and treating me like a man, that started to shape my own sense of myself, because I couldn't see myself as a man until I literally could see the reflection back in the mirror and also in other people's response to me and how they treated me. And so slowly over the course of the next couple of years, so I'd say it took about maybe 2.5, 3 years for me to get to a place of being comfortable saying something like FTM or trans man for myself, not just as a community. And then, and I didn't start using the word transsexual until a little bit later. And that's mostly because I find it really subversive and it pisses people off. And, I kind of like to do that. I'm a bit countercultural. I'm anti-conformity. And so I find it really interesting that when I was younger and anti-conformist, it was rebelling against the non-LGBT community. But nowadays, it seems like the people that are the conformists are the LGBT community in some ways, aligned with the corporations and the government. And I'm like, what happened, right? We're supposed to not be aligned with corporations and the government. So I haven't really changed much, but who I'm more antagonistic toward and sort of pushing against are now, it's like flipped. It's kind of a strange phenomenon.
Yeah. That's happening on so many different levels of our society. Yeah. The left is now not the left, but the liberal or areas are now the more conformist and authoritarian for one reason or another.
Well, it's almost like there's maybe two different kinds of liberals. I mean, I think I hear people talk about there's liberals, like classical liberals, as like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
Dave Rubin would say, but then there's also the progressives.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people separate them out. It's like, are you willing to torch a building or not? Like, let's, let's sort of separate out, and do you support the torching of buildings, right? Like, that doesn't seem like a very liberal stance. But at the same time, revolutions, have been all kinds of violence towards people and buildings, right? Property happens in a revolution. So it's just sort of hard to know, like, is this a righteous revolution or not, right? How to decipher those differences. And that's just not in my scope of practice. I stay out of it, which, like, I don't work with children or teenagers either as a licensed clinical social worker. It's like, I stay out of that world because I can. I don't get too embedded in that because I don't think I'm very good at arguing. I didn't learn debate tactics. And so when somebody has a really strong argument, it takes me a while to figure out how to respond to that. I'm not very quick. I can't just back and forth like people do. I do not know how to do that. So I usually just go, and I ask questions. Well, tell me more about that. Or, how do you see that playing out in your life? I almost become clinical with it. Sometimes because I really want to know, and other times because I just want to hear people like say it out loud, how crazy and corrupt their thinking is.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people I remember I heard years ago, there was somebody who called into one of those talk shows on the radio saying, we should kill all the homosexuals. And the woman who was taking the call said, how do you propose we do that? And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting tactic. She didn't call him and she didn't dehumanize him. But at the same time, she was sort of like, let's pull this out a little bit. Mm-hmm. Like, how really wacko are you? Like, where have these ideas come from? What's formed your opinion about these things? So I'm more with curiosity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think I practice that way of engagement as well.
It's less stressful, I think. Right?
It's more of a patient game.
But it's like debate. If I feel like I'm being, put on the spot, and it gets my heart rate all going, and yeah.
So your story of transition it's novel. I've never heard somebody describe their transition. It was just so gradual, and and you're older.
I've heard
so
it many times.
Oh, really?
Oh, I've heard it many, many, many times. And as a matter of fact, when my wife went with me to see that doctor to talk about getting the testosterone that first time, and I told her why I wanted to transition, and I looked at her and I said, is that an okay reason? Have you heard that before? And she's like, many times, but nobody talks about it. Because you're supposed to fit through the eye of the needle. Right? Oh, I've known since I was this age. I feel born in the wrong body.
Okay.
I was going to kill myself if I couldn't transition. And so none of those things were true for me. And so, But I've heard many people since they come to me, right? You've probably had this. People will say to you, oh, yeah, that's happened to me, or I agree with it. But they're not going to say it publicly because they don't want to be on the receiving end of any attacks.
Okay. Because there's a right way
Yes.
to do this.
Yes. There are some challenges to that now because people will say you don't need gender dysphoria to transition. Mm-hmm. And which, I understand that. I don't know exactly what they mean by it, but I could listen to that, kind of talk, to hear what they mean. But there's a lot of people. I mean, in a nutshell, people would say, oh, so you basically just transitioned to escape homophobia. That's what people have said to me. And it's like, well, if you want to really reduce it down.
But it was more about gender than your sexual orientation, it sounds like. It was just the way that society saw you. There's always friction there.
Yeah, it's a bit rough to be a masculine woman in the world.
Hmm.
I don't know how it is now. I would imagine there's some similarities, but maybe I have no idea. I'm just going out on a limb here, but maybe there's something still happening because there's so many more people who are female who are wanting to not align with being a woman.
Hmm.
And I don't know what their sexual orientation is, but I wonder if it has something more to do with the way they express themselves. They don't want to be held to a rigid gender role. It's like, well, but you can scoff at gender roles. You can rebel against gender roles. I mean, I did it for many, many years. I think I just reached a threshold.
Hmm.
I don't know that being 16 or 17 or even 22 is a threshold necessarily. But maybe it is for them, right? Everybody has different distress tolerance levels.
Yeah. There's a contingent of this conversation that I have not explored, and I've gotten some flack for not interviewing them. They're called trans widows. It's women whose husbands transition years, decades into their relationship, and there's a lot of friction there. I haven't covered it because talking about like a divorced relationship or talking about a marriage is just so complex, especially if it ended badly or if there's a lot of stress. It's too difficult for me to get into. And you're free to completely ignore this question, but it just sounds like your wife accepted you and that it wasn't a big problem for her to conceptualize herself with a male version of you or a manlier version of you. It was just, it was pretty acceptable or easy for her to change.
Yeah. We've actually done, we've spoken together on a few of occasions, talking about this and not the same issue. This interesting thing about the trans widows, I haven't heard it in that exact way. It does frame it in a way that probably makes sense. Because in some ways they might be feeling abandoned. One of the issues that I run up against quite often as a clinician and in clinical spaces is that I want to pick a better word. Sort of it's not coming to me. So I'll say like rejection of or denial of grief and loss in the transition process, right? So like as a person who went through a transition, there was a certain level of grief because I lost things. I lost my relationship to the lesbian community. I lost the role that I had, right? I was my father's daughter. Now I'm my father's son. And now my father has dementia. So he's a little confused about his son now coming to visit him because he's probably wondering where his daughter is, right? And we're getting to that point now. And so when I lost, there's a certain way in which I could be in the world that was a protective factor, right? Being a more masculine woman, I was less likely to face a particular kind of harassment. But I was more exposed to other kinds of harassment. But as a man in society, like there's no shields at all. Like there's been more engagement towards me as a man in society in that more aggressive way than previously as a woman, right? So there's a sense in which there's a loss of relationships or roles or a loss of something. It could be a job. Who knows what it is? And our family members are going through a similar process, right? So a wife is probably grieving a loss, but there's this attempt to basically say, no, you're not allowed to feel that way. Your wife is becoming her authentic self, and that person's thinking, but my husband, where's my husband, right? And so I think we should find a way to recognize and help people process that grief and loss without labeling them transphobic or they're in denial. But I also think trans people, we need to find people outside of our relationships and our families, maybe for kind of support that can help us recognize and be compassionate and empathetic towards our family members who are struggling. I think parents struggle, partners struggle, spouses, children, siblings, everybody. I think a lot of people struggle, but it's perceived of as being a denial of the reality that this trans person is emerging into their authentic self. And it's like, they can emerge all they want and people can still have grief. I don't, these things, you can have both of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea of a trans person having grief and feeling a sense of loss, there's been this fear. I don't know if it's happening so much anymore, but in the past, there would have been more of a fear around, if I don't say the right thing to the therapist, I'm not going to get that letter I need to get the hormones or the surgeries I need. So it probably would have been too frightening to bring up a sense of grief or loss.
And well, and the framing of trans care as affirmation care in and of itself kind of incentivizes not looking at the difficulty and therefore being dishonest about the difficulties, the real human factors that take time and need processing space.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big fan of incorporating more of the explorative, right? The exploratory functions of psychotherapy into working with anybody, really. Yeah. I think what's happening recently that I don't really like is people are labeling exploratory kinds of therapy with people identifying as some sort of trans or gender nonconforming, people thinking maybe they have gender dysphoria, trying to figure out if they do or not, that's being labeled as anti-trans or even conversion therapy. And it's like, no, conversion therapy is never good unless somebody elects to go to a conversion therapist. Like, some adults just don't want to be gay or trans. Like, okay, I mean, if you think that's going to work for you, but, forcing people into that is another thing. Now, are there conversion therapists or reparative therapists who are calling what they do exploratory? I don't know. If they are, then we need to make sure to differentiate between exploratory, affirmative, and conversion or reparative. They're three separate things. And, and none of them are actually, like, I never learned gender affirmation therapy intervention model in my MSW program. I don't know if they teach that as a method, as a model, right? And exploratory or conversion. So these are all things that people are doing. It's more a way of making sense of how they are interacting with the client or patient. And I don't know why exploratory is problematic. I mean, that's our role. Our role is to help the people we're working with explore who they are, all their options, how they're making sense of their past. I mean, it's embedded into what we do as psychotherapists. So I'm not really sure why there's a problem there, unless they're connecting it directly to conversion therapy. And I did see that recently. I was on a website recently that listed all of these gender exploration oriented websites as anti-trans conversion therapy websites. And I was like, but I know some of those people. Those are not anti-trans people. Some of them are actually trans clinicians who do an exploratory style, right, of therapy.
And I think that comes from the activist mindset or framework to kind of reorient the field in order to destroy gates and to open it up to anybody who wants it and to make it accessible to all. But in the long run, that's making the case for transition even more fraught, because you're going to get a lot more detransitioners. You're going to get a lot more regret. You're going to get a lot more false positives, let's say, if there's no resistance, and resistance is too strong a word. Exploration. If there's no exploration, if there's no ability to question and to think through and to deal with all these subtleties of the process and the reality of the process, that's not care. That's not caring for people.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, what was happening, a few years ago and for, several decades that they refer to as this gatekeeping really was, there were mental health providers out there and medical doctors who were like forcing people to go like through a year's worth of therapy sessions
Hmm.
And that felt very limiting. And for some people, it was maybe even unnecessary, right? Like it should be an individual case by case situation. If people don't have comorbidities, they shouldn't be forced into a year's worth of psychotherapy. But there are alternatives to that. Maybe they could join a peer-based discussion / support group with other trans people who are in a similar stage of you in their understanding of their identity or their process of transition. Because I really do believe that it's good to have a support system, right? But not everybody needs psychotherapy. As a social worker, of course, I think everybody should go through a comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment, and that can take, a few sessions. But the reason for that is gathering up all the information that then informs a social worker to say, okay, these are the resources you might need. These are the referrals I recommend for you. These are the people I want to link you with, right? These are the resources that are available for you, in the community, now online even too. So the only way you know about all those things is if you do the comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment. And not a lot of other medical practitioners or mental health providers do a comprehensive biopsychosocial. That's basically the bread and butter of social workers. And so I say my solution is just get a social worker. Even they don't even have to be licensed, because you're not diagnosing. You're just doing a biopsychosocial assessment, but very comprehensive one. And so you find out, like, tell me a little bit about your schooling and your family and your employment and your finances and your health and your sleep and your diet and your exercise, right? It's very comprehensive. And from there, you find out enough about the person to be able to know what they might need. And so, but a lot of like, say, for example, trans surgery centers or programs, they will have mental health providers, but they won't have somebody that's doing like that sort of case management level of social work that could be doing this, right? Like, I'm all for everybody should have a biopsychosocial assessment before going on to whatever the next phase is. And through that, you can find, there's some comorbidities, and you can refer somebody to a psychotherapist. And the psychotherapist can go through the analysis, the whatever, if they meet criteria for depression or anxiety or any of those kinds of things, right? So it's like, I think they could be separated out. The standards of care don't really do that, the WPATH standards of care. And I wish they did. I wish they were more clear on that. Like, it's not everybody needs psychotherapy. It's that everybody, it would be a good recommendation for people to do that assessment. And that would screen out not every person who feels failed by the system. The people who have either detransitioned or desisted from moving towards transition. It wouldn't get all of them, of course, but I think it would. I don't think we'd have as many as we have right now because of more of the free range harm reduction clinics, or what they call informed consent clinics. They're a bit more like harm reduction clinics, which is more coming from the drug and alcohol treatment world, where if we don't give them access to these things, they might kill themselves, or they might, self-medicate with street, hormones or other drugs and alcohol to sort of numb, right? Because with informed consent, you have to be able to know that somebody can consent and that someone has been informed. It's not just signing a piece of paper that says informed consent at the top. Yeah. So I have a big issue with using informed consent in kind of a maybe lackadaisical way.
Well, I mean, that is in order to forestall a backlash on a societal level, or at least within the detrans community who need services of their own, and the rising tide of, like feminism trying to protect women from males entering their spaces. All these issues are kind of at play. And one of the basic things that you're bringing to the table is just like standards of care. Just fix that. And make sure that people have access to the help that they need. And then all these other social issues and
because if you find out during a biopsychosocial assessment that somebody has suicidal ideation and they have since they were 14, well, that's an indicator that maybe they should be seeing somebody. for that. One of the things I noticed about, it's not all, of course, I don't want to paint too broad of a stroke, but I do listen to and I do pay attention to people who have desisted or detransitioned. I consider them part of the community. And I think that some of them have experienced too lax of a system in order to get access to hormones without having, again, a comprehensive social biopsychosocial assessment. The other thing that I noticed, though, in a lot of these cases is they do have comorbidities. They have psychosis. They are self-harming. They have, not everybody, of course, I'm just saying in general, the people I've been listening to, several of them, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, major depressive disorder,
child
adjustment
abuse.
disorder. Yeah, all kinds of trauma on top of it. And so, it's like I might have had a little bit of that kind of stuff when I was younger, but I sort of processed it through. So by the time I hit 39 years old, that stuff wasn't influencing, like I didn't come in with all that stuff. I don't have those comorbidities. I think that somebody who has the comorbidities, if they're having issues with mental health, with their mental illness, then that should be treated. Sometimes it's in conjunction. There are people who get it simultaneously, right? The cross-sex hormone therapy and the talk therapy and the psychotropics. And for some people, that's perfectly fine. For other people, maybe you do one before the other, right? It's hard to, it's because in the drug and alcohol treatment world, there's a similar kind of questioning about it. It's like, do we treat the mental illness before the drug addiction or the drug addiction or alcoholism before can you go into a treatment facility on psychotropic medications? Like there's some similarities in some ways of trying to suss out, right? It's like, maybe we shouldn't split things like that. So now you have like dual diagnosis programs. And so when people say, gender dysphoria is not a mental illness, I don't need psychotherapy. It's like, okay, if you go through a biopsychosocial assessment, they're just going to find out what resources you need and what referrals can be made for you and to make sure you have a good support system. Right? It sort of takes that little wedge issue out of there because I think there's just resistance. And then through that process, somebody might go, oh, that wasn't so bad. And maybe I would appreciate talking to somebody about the changes that are going to be happening to me as I start hormones, as I start, presenting in a different way, because the world's going to start treating you in a different way. And that might come as quite a surprise and might be uncomfortable and discombobulating, right? I found it very discombobulating. So, and I was 39. I don't know how 19-year-olds and 29-year-olds are doing all this without any of that support, because the peer support isn't enough. It's good. It's better than nothing. Family support is good. It's better than nothing. But somehow having somebody that you can talk to that is a bit objective and has a sort of a breadth of knowledge and understanding of the larger picture of what's happening, I think can be helpful. I think I would have benefited from that early on in my transition, but I didn't do it because I thought I don't need therapy. So I had the same resistance. So I understand it. I don't begrudge anybody who has a similar kind of resistance, but I know for myself that it would have been beneficial in the early first few years.
So was testosterone fun or a drag? How did you take to it?
I think I've been very fortunate, because when I hear about people who say that testosterone sent them to the psych unit, or made them really angry and aggressive, it was the total opposite for me. I was a very angry and aggressive woman, right? Because I was angry all the time because I felt assaulted all the time by people's prejudice. And so I felt like I was walking around with this suit of armor. And I haven't said this in a long time because I didn't remember, but I just remember now when you asked me that question. In the very early days, before I had top surgery, I was binding. I started testosterone. I was wearing a compression T-shirt. And I said to somebody, I feel like 100 pounds have been lifted off me. Like I was walking around with a suit of armor, basically like, don't fuck with me kind of attitude all the time. And I didn't have to it wasn't like I made a conscious choice, like, I don't have to do this anymore. It just happened. Somehow I felt different.
Yeah.
I think maybe at first it was I felt safer until I realized, oh, there's a whole nother issue that I'm going to have to deal with about safety in public. But I didn't know it at the time. I just thought, oh, I'm done with all that. And I think that was left over from the separatist days, which are, the world is men's oyster, so to speak, And I knew differently, of course, because I'd been in the military and law enforcement. I knew that wasn't true, but it's hard sometimes to hold many true things at once in your head. So I was less angry. Yeah. I was less aggressive, if not almost not entirely. I started testosterone and my menstrual cycle just stopped like that, stopped completely. I described it to somebody once as saying that every month I had 1 week where I was premenstrual, 1 week where I was menstrual, 1 week where I was postmenstrual, and 1 week where I was like, just felt normal. And now I have 52 of those weeks every year. That 1 week, I have it all the time now. I just feel calm and just calm, just normal. It feels really good. Yeah. I think I had more mood fluctuation previous to testosterone in my system. I have had a total hysterectomy, so I don't have ovaries, so I'm not producing as much estrogen as I was before. But yeah,
it's interesting. I'm just trying to suss out. So you had society had expectations of you as a woman that you weren't abiding by because you weren't that kind of woman, and so you had to constantly overcompensate for failing all the expectations or disrupting society's expectations. And then once you start to transition, those expectations of you being a woman and not being a woman and disappointing those expectations, generally speaking, in society, go away. And then you have to deal with the expectation of being a man at some point. You're like, okay, people are gonna see me differently. They're gonna see me as a threat or something to threaten. There's a whole power politic that you weren't aware of that men have to deal with. What insight can you give into the life of men in America by becoming one, emerging into it later in life?
I think what you said, the way you sort of encapsulated the experience, it's an entirely different frame than I would use because it sounds too passive for me. But I never felt like I was, the victim of anything. I was fighting against it. So it's just, I framed it differently, but it stands, right? It makes sense if you just sort of flip it on the other side. But as a man, I think you're right. I didn't know about the sort of power, the dominance hierarchy thing within men. I exposed myself to large groups of men pretty early on because I wanted to understand it a little bit more, like what am I getting myself into kind of thing. And so I started going to like men's weekend workshops.
Okay.
Or mixed co-ed workshops where there would be a point in time over the course of the weekend where all the men would separate, right? The men and women would separate. And in the past, if I was in an environment like that, I would refuse to go in either group, and I'd stand in the middle of the room and say, I'm making space for those who don't want to go to the men's or the women's. And there'd be a few of us, and we'd stand our ground, as the androgynous, genderqueer, fabulous people that we were. But in this case, I was like, oh, I'm going to go do this now.
Okay.
Right. And so at first I felt like an imposter, like I was intruding, like they were going to find out any minute that I wasn't supposed to be there. That never happened. And I started listening to men because they would be, once they were in male only space, I was like, wow, like these men they were like crying, or they were talking about the strained relationship with their fathers and the kind of abuse they suffered by their mothers or their sister. I was sort of like, I had no idea that men even talked that way, that they had those kinds of struggles. And not all of them, of course, but the ones who weren't, they were so supportive. They put an arm around them. they'd say, there was typically one or two guys in the room that would sort of rally people around, like, come over here, men, let's show this brother some love. And I thought, what? The women are definitely not doing that kind of stuff. It was more like commiserating. That was my experience. It was so supportive. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. And typically what I would do is on the last day, I would tell the men that I was a trans man. And it never failed. Every single time, typically one of those guys, I'll call them the man's man, right? Not cocky, just confident, right? Not like tough guy, right? Not the alpha male, the man's man, a very different kind of guy, I've noticed. That person would come up to me without fail, almost every time. They'd come up to me either in front of the room, like not in front of the room, but in the room with other men, or one-on-one, and smack me on the chest, which I wasn't familiar with at first, the smacking on the chest thing, or on the back, and say, nice to meet you, brother, or welcome to the brotherhood, or something like that. And I was like, wow, I felt, yeah, it was a really wonderful experience. And I try to share that experience with trans men that I mentor that are really early in their transition, about, like, we can't make all these assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions about who cis men are, right? Cisgender men, and how they were raised and what they think about things. And it's like, oh no, like, I don't want to be summed up in that way. And so I don't sum up other people in that way. And I try to sort of pass that on, that I've met some really, really wonderful men, and I was raised by a wonderful man. My father's a wonderful man. And and I know that there are most men are good, right? As a former law enforcement officer, most police are good, like, right? It's these kinds of things that I know. And so I don't really listen to all that, but it comes up all the time. If I'm in quote unquote FTM space, there's inevitably a group of people in that space that will be very, very derogatory and very, like, dehumanizing towards cis men or men who aren't trans. And I just don't participate in that. And I challenge it, but I try and do it in a way that doesn't cause a big scene.
Could you give an example of how that's to fruitfully challenge that?
Yeah, I did it recently. I was at a all trans men's event a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, and somebody made a comment about how really hard it is to reach, cis men, and the way their sexism and their misogyny and the way they're talking in the workplace, and sometimes they just don't listen. And so I turned to the person and I said, do you listen to them? Like, do you know, right? You might not like what they're saying or how they're saying it. Do you know anything about them and their life story? Because what I have found to be true is that there's a lot of fronting that goes on, right? It happens a lot with adolescent boys, but I think grown men sometimes still do it when they're in mixed company. They're not sure what to say or how to say it, so they'll sort of test the waters. I don't know if you've experienced that, where they might say something, like really outlandish to kind of see, like, did that just go on? Like, nobody said anything? Like, it's like to sort of test the waters. I think that happens all the time. And so I'm like, maybe they don't believe anything they just said, but you'll never know that. You're making an assumption about them because you're rejecting them. But you don't want them to reject you. So I'm like, sometimes we have to be able to meet people where they are, right? That's sort of a social work 101. You meet people where they are. So I take that into that space and say, maybe next time you could just ask them questions. And I tell them, and I did do it then, I told them the story of a gentleman that I work with through FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, Daryl Davis, right? He's a black man who has talked with, countless members of the Ku Klux Klan, and over 200 of them have left the Klan as a result of the relationship that he built with them, because he listens to them, he talks to them, and he doesn't dehumanize them. He doesn't like the racism, but he treats them like a human being. And so I think we should be treating each other like human beings, and not just generalize, well, cis men and they're anti this or pro that. And it's like, you don't know that. You don't know that.
How did you get into social work? When did that come across your radar?
I was working in case management. Oh gosh, when was that? Mid 2000s. I was working in case management, and I was wanting to do more work in like healthcare, providing trainings, maybe like Trans 101 kind of trainings. And I noticed that the people that were getting those kinds of jobs were either people with masters of public health or masters of social work.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed also the people that were doing case management and getting higher pay for it were also people with a master's of social work degree. So I decided to look into that. And I thought about also like marriage and family therapy and maybe psychology. I looked into a couple of different options, but I really liked the social work frame, the lens that social work looks at things through. And so I selected social work, but it was really because I wanted more access to the things I wanted to do. And I got that access. It did work out the way I had hoped. Right out of school, I went to work with the VA, and I was a social worker with the VA. And then I transferred over to the DOD and was a social worker with the Navy. And now I've been freelance for about 2 years now. But I love, I'm doing the kind of work I love doing. So now it's more focused on wellness. I do emotional wellness and personal growth workshops for corporate clients, for their employees. Right, because with the pandemic and burnout and all this, all the stuff going on in the world, it's impacting employees, and so bringing wellness into that space is really important right now. So that's what I do.
Earlier, you gave an analogy, like if there's some sort of activity or activism going on, you're the one going around making sure that everybody's like getting water and know where the bathroom is, and just organizing the space and granting people situational awareness. In or within the grand trans topic, you have your feminists, you have your detransitioners, you have your trans people who just kind of want to live their life, then you have the radical trans rights activists, then you have like all these weird characters in between. The lay of the land, it's a muddy, raucous, busy place. What do you think is something that you could just put out there to give people more orientation, who are in it or who are trying to figure it out? Like, how do we orient ourselves in order for it to decrease in chaos and increase in order?
Great question, Benjamin. Well, the first thing I would say to people is the trans Twitter world is not the trans world. Right? That's such a small fraction of the members of our community and the people who consider themselves allies to the community. Very few of them are on Twitter, right? Like that's not where a lot of the work is being done, right? So the work is being done in the local areas. It's being done through Facebook groups. That's still really popular in the trans community, at least in the FTM community. There's still a lot of Facebook groups, right? So things that have gone on to like the people who were on Tumblr and went to TikTok, yeah, like that's a whole different like strain of the trans community that is completely outside of my purview. Like I don't interact with people that are part of that world. So the majority of what I see are people who are going to work every day, or doing meaningful work in the sense that maybe it's not a salaried or hourly paid job because they have some sort of disability or they're retired or something, right? So they're doing meaningful work. They have families. They're involved in their communities. They're just doing good work, right? Like that's the majority of us. We're living our lives and we're working in those small ways. It's like maybe making sure that in our local area we have access to competent healthcare providers, right? That we have access to behavioral health specialists who have done more than just a cursory training in trans stuff, right? That there's a lot of websites out there. I think that what happens now, the problem is that with the proliferation of social media and the internet, it's hard to know how to filter things. So it used to be back in the day when I started my transition, the internet was, in its baby phase and there wasn't hardly anything on the internet. I had to look things up through the phone book or go to the library or the LGBT community center. That was typically a place to go, or the gay bar, something like that. Now you can type in like transgender into a search engine well, you're going to get too many hits, too many results. How do you filter through that? How do you figure that out? And so I recommend that people go somewhere where they can meet people in person, right? Even if it's electronically, like digitally, right? There's Discord groups and they do like video chats. There's groups that do Zoom chats. There's even now with, the pandemic, it's not over, of course, but in some places, I think it's over, but in some places they're behaving like it's not over, and in some places they are. And so like here in Florida, right, I can go to in-person groups, but there are still the virtual groups. Like there are people that have done what you want to do or what you're doing now. And if you want to have a different kind of conversation, you need to look for different people. If you want to be an ally to the community, you have to know that the community is vast, diverse. We are not a monolith. And the reason I say that is because I will have people who refer to themselves as allies to the trans community call me a transphobe because I refer to myself as a transsexual. It's like, well, that's a term I use. And a lot of us use that word. So they'll police our languaging. So it's like, just don't do that, right? There's a lot of stuff around pronouns too now that are getting challenging for people. Should we or shouldn't we compel it, right? People consult with me and corporations, should we or shouldn't we do that? And I don't think it's a good idea to compel it, right? So it's one of those things where I don't like to be asked my pronouns. And I know lots of transsexuals who don't like to be asked their pronouns. So, and for some people who haven't even started transition, it makes them feel more dysphoric to be asked their pronouns. So it's like we have to be careful of just sort of that reinforcement. But just know that if you're part of the community or you want to be an ally to the community and you don't like what you see on social media, you could do what I did and just get rid of all of it because I don't have any of it, or just find other outlets, because we're out here, we're doing good work, and we're making the world a better place by working with people, not against people. And that's the big difference, right? We're not dehumanizing people, calling them names, right? I would never refer to somebody as a TERF, right? I don't resort to name calling, and most of us don't. Right? If you're seeing that, that's not the community. That's certain members who are claiming to be part of the community, but we don't really know. I mean, you can't really know. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's helpful. I really appreciate getting to speak with you and being able to incorporate your story and your wisdom into this series of mine on this topic. It's good. You're a good person and you bring good stuff to the table, and we need more goodness in the world in order to take down the craziness quotient a little bit and also give people hope.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. What I'll say is that I've watched a bunch of your videos, and one of the things that I appreciate about the work that you're doing, even outside of gender stuff, you talk to a lot of different people, and I was introduced to you in the beginning because you were covering the stuff that was happening at Evergreen College. That's how I learned about you back in the day, and so you don't know. I don't know whether you agree or disagree with the people you're talking to. Like, you keep a really sort of that open frame, that curious frame. You don't seem to sort of weigh in too much. You just sort of ask questions, let people talk. And I appreciate that, because there are people that you've interviewed that have said things that I'm like, well, now that just sounds wrong, but I don't know what their experience is. But my hope is that you don't receive too much grief, because you do have a very broad audience, or it's not really the audience, well, probably that too, but you have a broad spectrum of people you interview. And so I would imagine that people can make up their minds about, oh, that Benjamin, he must be a such and such because he talked to so-and-so. And it's like, that's too limited. It's like, it's really broad. And so to be part of that, I appreciate that. I just appreciate that you were interested in talking with me, and that, yeah. And, you know, my intention is not to counter anybody who's ever been interviewed by you on this topic, but just to add a whole nother layer to it, or another segment perhaps to that, right? Because everybody's living their own life, right? This idea that we're becoming our authentic selves and we have our own lived experience. I don't know when all of a sudden it became, oh, no, not that kind of authenticity, not that kind of lived experience. You have to have these approved kinds of lived experience. Your lived experience isn't approved. And that's sort of, nobody's said those exact words to me, of course, but I have been called all kinds of names and canceled from events. And people write all kinds of ugliness about me on Facebook, which thankfully I don't see because I'm not on Facebook, but people tell me about it. And so, you know, it is what it is. But for me, I'm like, well, this is my authentic self. I'm speaking from my heart and my lived experience. And that's all I have. That's it. You know?
Well, so you say that you deleted all of the social media, but do you have a blog out there or a book out there? If people want to hear more from you and learn more from you, where can they go, or what can they find?
Sure.
Is a smattering of podcasts here and there?
I'm a guest on podcasts fairly regularly. I have a website, so it's zanderkeig.net, and so that will take you to a bunch of information about me. I wrote a blog in 2007 that I had planned on continuing with, but you know how that happens. It was called The Tao of Transition, and I was using Taoist ideas or principles to frame my transition. It was a good effort, but I got lost in other things. But I think I wrote maybe three posts. So if people want to look up Tao of Transition, that's out there in the interwebs. And so on my webpage, you'll see like the books that I published and the documentaries that I've been in and things like that, and some YouTube videos and podcasts. So they're not all on there, but enough to let people know, who I am and what I'm about.
And you're also working with FAIR, Foundation Against Something in Racism, and other
intolerance
and racism. What other organizations that you think you want to put on people's radar?
There's the Institute for Liberal Values is it's like a collaboration or coalition of organizations doing good work in the world. So, for example, like Free Black Thought and Integrity Matters by Jodi Shaw. She was from Smith College. Counterweight with Helen Pluckrose. So it's like a consortium or a collaboration, coalition of all these different. There's a bunch more in there doing some really great work around the country.
All the sane libs,
basically, yeah. The true kind of Enlightenment era values kind of liberals. Yeah. And that's what FAIR is all about too. I'm a senior fellow with FAIR and on the advisory board. So I do a lot of things. And, part of the issue is that there are people on the advisory board get labeled as conservatives, but in a derogatory way. Because to be conservative is not derogatory, but they'll use it like, oh, they're conservative. Or they won't say that. They'll say right wing. That's the language they'll use. And some people think that there's members of the advisory board that are left wing. So that's when we're nonpartisan. So that's when you're sort of hitting almost a sweet spot because I don't think Megyn Kelly is right wing and she's on the advisory board. But we have like Peter Boghossian and Jonathan Haidt and Steven Pinker and Abigail Shrier. Abigail Shrier is one of the people that people are angry about. Like they ask me, why am I part of something that Abigail Shrier is part of? It's like, well, because I am, and we talk, and we've done panels together, and she doesn't talk about trans adults. She has trans adult friends. She's more focused on the trans kids, and that's not my wheelhouse. That's not my scope of practice. I don't have anything to do with the trans kids. I haven't researched it. I haven't, gone down that alley. She has to the degree to which she's done that. So, so it's, we don't all have to agree with each other. We're not on the advisory board, because we all agree with each other. It's that we agree with the principles
Yeah, yeah.
of FAIR.
One of which is free association and associating with people that you disagree with.
Absolutely. So that we don't get locked into groupthink.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is
Yeah.
a danger right now.
Yeah.
Well, Zander, I'm going to wrap up the recorded part of the interview. I'm sure that tons of people are going to thoroughly enjoy this, and I did as well. So thank you so much for your time. And
You're very welcome. Thank you so much.